Welcome, Andrea Amico from Atlanta in the United States. Straight off the bat on Based Podcast. Is my car spying on me? Should I know something about this?
Probably yes. Well, it depends on what you drive. If you drive a very old, nice vehicle from 30, 40 years old, you'll be fine. But if you drive something recent, not so much.
It's not. It's a brand new Ford Ranger, unfortunately, and I've seen it on your website. And so I'm being watched everywhere. It's a fascinating topic. The reason I reached out to you the other day was because I saw a podcast you did with another person, and I was just fascinated by this because, of course, here in Australia we talk a little bit about how much our phones spy on us. But I don't think anyone's really across this topic or talks about this topic of how much data is bleeding and being seen through your cars, and obviously newer cars. But what's the lie of the land? Tell me about it. I mean, should we be worried here in Australia?
Yes, and the situation in Australia is unfortunately not any different than in the United States and Canada and the UK and Europe. We've done statistics also in Australia, and the numbers are just about the same. Cars collect a lot of data. We can talk about what kind of data they collect. This data is typically stored and encrypted on your car. So think of your car as like an encrypted hard drive. And then when people sell it, nobody deletes it. So the next owner can have access to the text message of the old person. The old person can locate and track the new person. And there seems to be no safeguards in Australia yet.
So, I mean, there's so much to take in there, but let's start with the basics. The car itself is effectively like a computer on wheels now. If we think about it in those terms, it's got cameras, it's got a SIM card of its own, it's got Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So there are many different angles as to how the data can be used and leaked. And of course, it's got the smartphone with its own apps plugged into there. Where does it start? Like, what's the snapshot of where this data is being taken? Is it the phone, or is it the car, or is it a combination of all of the above?
Yes. Yes, it's a combination of both. So cars have a lot of sensors in them, and over time that amount of sensors have just grown, and the capabilities of those sensors have grown, and this should not be shocking to your audience. And so, before even you get in a car, your car is logging that you're near the car because it senses the key next to it. It logs when you open the door. As soon as you sit, it logs how much you weigh. And then you turn it on, and cameras goes on, and microphones go on, and you have all this data that is captured, literally terabytes and terabytes of data. And then in addition, as you pointed out, all the time. And as you pointed out, then also people bring, devices like these ones that we carry in our pockets, right? And they connect them. And cars have been designed in such a way that when you connect your phone, your car essentially downloads and stores a mini clone of your phone inside the car. But it's unencrypted, and so and you can go and browse what's the content of a phone with very little technological knowledge. In Australia, Australia is where the very first cases that I know of came out of domestic abuse that were perpetrated by people who were using this technology in cars. And so, yes, cars not only have privacy problems, but privacy problems in cars tend to become security problems, safety problems, financial problems. You may have read articles recently about people whose insurance was jacked up because the cars told the insurance company how they were driving without people really knowing. And so, cars are a very interesting and very peculiar case, and they're complex. And that's my little area of expertise.
Yeah, so, and how did you come into this? I mean, you've obviously got a fair depth of knowledge about it now, but what was the moment that sort of brought you into understanding this and then getting involved with, with the fight against it, I suppose?
Yeah, I was in automotive for a while, and one of the companies I was running was a very large used car inspection. So we inspected cars, when you return them at the end of the lease, or rental companies cars before they were resold, and it was really for mechanical things, right? Is the car has any damages and these kind of things. But one of my clients was being investigated by a federal agency on how they were treating data of customers. Of course, nothing to do with cars. But I was curious. They were due for an audit, and I sit down in a car, and I remember like yesterday, right? And And I'm sitting in the car, and after a minute, I go like, uh-oh. And I open Google Maps on my phone, and I turn it to satellite view, and I start to count. I look at this house, and I count 1, 2, 3 garage doors. I have 1, 2, 3 live garage door opener codes, and of course, I know where this lady lives. I know where she works. I know where she takes the kids to school. I know she's a breast cancer survivor, and I have a great list of restaurants, which is great. But that was shocking to me. And I started to talk to people about what I could find in cars, and nobody really seemed to know much about it. Or even worse, they thought that cars worked in ways that really didn't seem to be real. And so I was curious. I start to look into it. I think I'm credited with doing the first statistics on what data is left in cars and how often. Then I started to hack into cars. That's when it became really interesting, because I discovered you could do a lot of things that people really thought were really hard. But I taught my 8-year-old daughter how to hack mom's car to extract her text messages, right? And so that became a passion project. And I didn't, I'm not in your position, which I can pass laws. And so if I wanted to make a difference, the only thing I knew was how do I do it? And the only thing I knew was how to start a company. And so I started a company with the mission of, let's make the world of cars a little bit more private. And that's where we are. That's what we do.
It feels like the technology revolution has sort of changed all the old norms in a way. I mean, I always say that the social media side of phones has disrupted the news business. We used to have laws in Australia which prevented people, we still do, I should say, have laws which prevent one person or one company from owning all of the media. But it feels like the laws haven't caught up with a lot of these technological aspects, and this privacy in cars and privacy off your phone issues really, I think, are another example of that, how the laws just haven't adapted to a fast pace of technology. In order to understand it though, and know what to do about it and what we can do about it, it's just interesting to have perhaps a real life example. I'm just interested, if you could step me through, because there's so much in that. There are microphones and cameras and your phone and text messages and accessing data and all this sort of stuff. If we took an example, let's say, of a person getting in their car to go and visit their parents, for example, who live on the other side of town, how would that? Can you step me through the sort of data that would be leached or leaked or siphoned off or given away through a simple trip like that, starting with plugging your phone into your car, or even earlier? I don't know. What would that look like in real terms?
Yeah, so cars create logs, right? So everything you do in your car is logged based on the sensors on your cars, including the nature of the logs and the detail depends on the car by car basis. But let's suppose that it's your car, right? You said you drive a brand new Ford, right? So as soon as you approach the car will sense you. It will know it's you because it recognizes your key versus, say, your wife's key. When you sit down, it will take your weight. You would start. That event is logged. The infotainment powers up. Your phone will sync automatically, which means that now whatever is new in your car since the last time you were in the car gets downloaded once again into the vehicle, and then you start driving, right? And anything from how you press the brakes and the throttles, and whether you're speeding, you're hard cornering, all those events are logged. If you're traveling with somebody, the car will know that. It will know which door has opened. Is it the front? Is it the back? Is it likely to be an adult or a kid based on the weight? You now, with newer cars, you have, like your car has a driver monitoring system, which means there's a little camera hidden in there, and there's no red light flashing, but you're being recorded. Smile, you're on camera. Those systems were originally engineered for detecting, are you paying attention to the road, right? What are your eyes? Are you on the road, or you're paying attention to the phone, right? And if that's the case, typically you'll get some sort of alarms. Again, it was born out of safety. But one of the largest providers of these systems, 2 years ago, they bought a company that specializes in detecting emotions through AI. And so as you drive, now your emotions are being logged. And I don't know if you realize this, but when you have little icons that populate on your infotainment system, is because the manufacturer is really being paid by those companies to place essentially a mini billboard on your navigation system. And again, your data is being collected, and whatever was used originally for safety, in the last 10 years, companies started to look at this data as a gold mine that they should be monetizing. And so it doesn't matter whether you pay, your car is, I don't know, probably 50, 60,000 Australian dollars, right? A car like that, but your data is also being monetized. And people don't realize that because this information is disclosed in very long and very complex legal documents. When you go to dealerships really don't tell you. They really don't know themselves because they're in the same situation that you have, right? If you were to open I don't know in Australia, but here in the United States, for Ford, for instance, it takes 5 or 6 hours to read all the documents, to try to understand what happens to your data. And I don't think you really would really understand it either. But which company, which consumer does that? Nobody does that, right? And so in this ignorance, companies are thriving because they get to use data in ways that people don't understand.
And so you talk about this, I mean, we would all have seen the privacy statements and the privacy policies. Presumably buried in there is the detail about what the companies do and what they can't do and what they do with your data. But I mean, what do they say in there? I mean, there are different types of data, obviously. I mean, we've all seen the notifications in new cars, put your seatbelt on as a simple one. It knows you're there. It knows someone's in the passenger seat. You're saying that the cars are collecting that data and storing it inside the actual computer somehow on its memory somewhere?
Yeah. And your car, for instance, would typically hold somewhere between 1 and 2 years of history, stored locally, right? And then some data that is there gets transferred also telematically. Your car has its own little cell phone. So even if you don't connect this, your car is a little bit like ET. It calls home all the time. And for some things, it's awesome, right? You get traffic updates so you don't get stuck in traffic. You may get a software update so that a security patch of the vehicle is automatically fixed. Those things are great. But it also means that whatever you're doing in the car and all this data gets transferred not just to the manufacturer, but to literally hundreds of companies that provide the services and systems inside the vehicles. And if you read the privacy policies, they will tell you that those companies reserve the right to use their data for essentially whatever they want.
Yeah, essentially, there's big money in data collection, of course. And I mean, what sort of money are we talking about from the companies that use this, and who are they that are taking it? So, for example, if you put an app on your phone, it's communicating through your car sometimes to the app manufacturers, of course. The map makers are the big one, but I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars per annum, presumably, on that data collection. It's valuable information, I suppose.
Oh, yeah. So back in 2017 or 2018, a company called McKinsey, I used to work there, by the way, it's a management consulting company. They come up with an estimate that vehicle data by 2030 would have been worth $750 billion on a global basis. Wow. The current revised estimate, the numbers keep going down, but the current revised estimate is somewhere between $400 and $600 billion. Still a lot of money. And of course, companies, everybody wants a slice of that.
And many people would have seen this, I suppose, on their Maps software, where the Maps programs will pick up where you've been. They'll sometimes highlight places that you've been or where your car is parked. And I suppose we all assume that that's staying locally, but that information is being sent. I mean, that's effectively how these map programs work. I mean, they tell you the traffic because they're sending your data away in conglomerate with other people, and then they're forming a view as to where the traffic is. I mean, it's actually pretty obvious when you think about it, I suppose.
Yes, and again, look, there are a lot of very good use cases, right? Data from cars can be used for wonderful things, ranging from making cars safer, reducing traffic, and providing convenience and services that consumers want. I think that the challenge that the automotive industry is facing right now is that things got probably a little bit out of hand. They wanted to monetize the data without really consumers understanding what was going to happen with the data. And there's a moment of backlash. And it really started probably here in the United States due to a number of disclosures, including from us on what type of data cars collected, and it became a topic. But recently started, I'm amazed that you're really, among the very few, but Australia starts to be something where people are starting to pay attention to this. And I think it's also the result of a series of data breaches that you had mainly on the telephony side. But I think that the Australian community is increasingly concerned about data security, and they should be looking at vehicles are just another cell phone. Just because it has 4 tires and an engine doesn't mean it actually works in any way. It's exactly the same type of technology, unfortunately. And unfortunately creates the very same risk, plus the fact that cars can be potentially dangerous on the road, right? I'm grateful that you are speaking about this now, because I think it's really a great time to start speaking about this in Australia.
Yeah, I think it's just something that Australians, generally are not broadly aware of. I mean, there obviously are many, but there's not a broad base understanding, I think, of this. And I think people assume, that the phones are doing that, but the cars being an extension of that, but also a little bit more as well. I mean, I think that's the thing that Australians will find shocking. What's the other equipment inside a car that sort of goes over and above the phone? I mean, I think you said in something I was watching that you're involved in, that the car itself has its own SIM card, which people might not be aware of. But there is other computer equipment on there as well, cameras, microphones, and all. What are the things that are additional to your phone, the computer equipment that sort of track and store data and send data?
Yeah, modern cars are a cluster of anywhere between 50 to 100 plus computers, all attached to in a network, just like literally. I think if you look at your driveway and imagine a pile of computers with wires attached to each other, that's exactly what a car actually is inside nowadays. People don't realize that 40% of the cost of a car nowadays is really driven by the electronics in it. It's no more the metal and the plastic, right? It is a big piece of consumer electronics. That's really what it is. And as you said, the car has clearly this, if we bring our own phones, but also has its own phone, and sometimes it has more than one. Some cars, say that you go to a dealership and the dealership tells you, well, you can reduce your insurance theft cost if you install this tracker. Now, guess what? You have a third cell phone inside that vehicle, right? So, and all of these things are working exactly the same way. They have their own SIM card, as you pointed out. The car has a phone number. Some people really don't realize, but every car has a phone number. And it's not like you can call it or, and talk to your car. That'd be cute. But it has a data connection just like you experience in your mobile phone, right? It is a mobile hotspot, essentially. And that's how people also get services like in-car Wi-Fi, which, again, provides great convenience and great services. But there's a dark side to it that I think it's important that people need to be realizing, right?
Yeah, and so it's communicating with, we would say mobile, you would say cell phone towers along the trip, along the journey, but also there are other sensors out there as well, aren't there, that are picking up Bluetooth, that are picking up your Wi-Fi. Sometimes, the local highway equipment, the local council equipment might also be picking things up. I mean, there's a wealth of ways in which the data is leaked.
Oh, yeah. There are many ways. And also your plate can be tracked. Or data from the plates can be combined with your, Wi-Fi identifier or the Bluetooth identifier, and you can overlay all this, information, and draw very detailed pictures of where people are, where they're going, what they're doing in their cars. And yes, so cars are not very private.
Apart from data brokers and companies that are selling and receiving the data as well, is there any evidence that law enforcement are using it or monitoring people in the United States? Is that something that's happening without people's knowledge, without, say, wiretaps or phone taps?
Yeah, so two interesting you'll find interesting. One is that there was recently an analysis done by 2 senators in the US Senate here who analyzed whether companies were giving data to law enforcement with a warrant always or also without. And it turns out that the norm is actually that companies will give data to law enforcement or the government, sometimes just upon a simple request. So there's no due process whatsoever. The other thing that you'll find interesting is that if I stop you and you have a cell phone and I want to extract the data from your cell phone, I typically need a warrant. Right? Unless I voluntarily clearly give it to you, right? The owner can always give this information away. But with cars, it's not the same. And in fact, there's a number of companies. There's a very big one called Burla that creates a kit. They actually operate in Australia as well. So, this is actually happening in Australia, where they provide hardware and software to essentially hack into the car and extract whatever they want. And there's no need for a warrant because there's no, again, the information in here is encrypted and has legal protections. And once you sit in a car and it syncs, encryption is lost, your protection are gone, and your legal protections are gone. And I think that those are, for instance, one of the big loopholes that the legislative branch should be looking at.
Yeah. And so you're talking about people, perhaps seeing the car walking by with some device, or are you talking about remotely accessing it from your office somewhere in a law enforcement building or somewhere else, a criminal?
Yeah, forensics is typically done, locally in the car, but that started to change too, because as you pointed out before, your car has a cell phone, and your data that used to be just in the car, so I need to plug into the car to extract the data. Now you don't have to do that anymore. Your data is going out in a number of places, and in fact, there's a news recently of 2 or 3 murder cases that I read about, in which the police brought us evidence information that was collected by the manufacturer or by big data companies that had the data in their database. It was not in the car anymore. It had migrated, and through that they could reconstruct what somebody was gone. Again, there are positive uses of this, as you can imagine, to solve horrible crimes, but shouldn't we follow the same due process that we need to follow for everything else?
And that's the point, I think, with this new world of data and IT and tech, is that the old norms don't necessarily, or the protections haven't been overlaid onto the new way of doing things, which I think is so staggering. And I think Australians will be absolutely shocked to learn some of this information. Frankly, I know that I knew a bit about it, but I didn't know all of this. It's quite incredible. And I guess there's the criminal side to it as well now. I mean, people have banking apps on their phones. As you say, a lot of that's encrypted. But presumably some of those apps are communicating, and there's all sorts of data. People have photos and videos on their phone, text messages. There's a lot of, there's basically everything about a person's life on there potentially being transmitted on their car, in particular their shopping habits. It'll tell you, presumably, sending off which shopping centres you go to and where you buy your fruit and all sorts of stuff.
I can tell you, the last car I rented, I looked at the YouTube history of the previous person.
Yeah.
It was there, because now cars have, they know what's your Google login, because they get it from your phone if you use certain applications. And, I go in there, I see the photo of the person, and the thumbnails that you have, if you have a Gmail account, right? I know exactly what the email address of the person is. And there's an icon on the dashboard that says YouTube, and you click on it and you see, hey, this is what this person is watching. And that's not right.
That's not right. And I can imagine the bad luck of the last person to rent a car getting you being the next one, knowing all the tricks and traps. That's a bit of bad luck from their point of view.
And especially, it takes a minute and a half for these rental car companies to just take care of it and make sure this data is removed. And I find it staggering that they wouldn't do that. Right? They vacuum the car, but they don't vacuum the infotainment. Yeah. I think it's crazy. And that's a simple example. But nowadays, you also see cases of financial fraud. Some of them, by the way, are completely involuntary.
And what about the issue of, as you say, when you rent a car, that's a particularly difficult scenario, I suppose. But potentially, if you're plugging your phone in, you're leaving all sorts of data, presumably, but your text messages, your phone log, they potentially, very likely, would go back with the next person to hire the car, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, all the rental car companies essentially have already been sued multiple times, some of them, about this issue. But what they do is that they prefer to settle it rather than actually, fixing the problem. But yes, I would never, I'm thinking of myself, right? This is not the first cell phone that I owned in my life. And the previous cell phones, when I bring them for ethical recycling, one, I try to delete the data myself, but I know that when I bring it to a center that has these ethical recycling guidelines, they will take care of removing the data for me, so I don't have to worry about it. And just like I wouldn't give my computer to somebody else. And the fact that we don't do the same with cars is absolutely nuts, but it's simply because people really look at the car as something that takes you from A to B. And I think that the more people realize that it's really, you're sitting on a pile of computers that record you as you go from A to B, I think that's really what is needed. Because I think once consumers understand that, they're pretty mad. They don't like this. And they
And
shouldn't.
is this? I mean, universally across all makes and models, presumably of brand new cars. I mean, these are standard features in most new cars now.
There are some differences, but the differences are mainly across time, as you can imagine, right? With newer cars, more and more technology comes, and that means that, again, we run a lot of studies over the last few years, and the number of data that the cars collect and how much data is left behind and how much data is transmitted, those three numbers keep going up every year. And so if you want a private car, probably you need to buy something older, but reality is that that's not a pragmatic solution. You can't go to consumer and say, buy a 20-year-old car. Cars need to be, people have other concerns, right? You need to find something that fits your budget, something that is safe to drive around, something that fits your family lifestyle. Privacy should not be something that prevents you from getting the car that you want, that you need. And so that's how we ended up in this mess.
And it's a very good point. I mean, the temptation would be for us all to go out and drive a 1980, Ford pickup rather than a 2023, 24 Ford pickup. It's not practical. And in any event, the world around us now is tracking people in ways we probably don't imagine anyway. This really is just another piece in the puzzle of the surveillance state in many ways, I think, isn't it? It's the sort of the corporate sector with its small part in the overall surveillance state. I mean, here in Australia, like in the US, we have cameras that detect whether you're touching your phone and whether you're doing this and whether you're doing that, and all sorts of sensors around the city for good reason in some case, as you rightly point out. I mean, there's often a very good security reason, but the flip side to that is giving away your information, giving away your data, giving away your liberty in a sense. It's very hard to avoid, but these cars now presumably are going to play a very important role in a future, way of watching citizens. It'd be very hard to do anything that potentially the government and the corporate sector doesn't know about with this model.
Yeah, and I think the cars are particularly important to look at for a number of reasons. One, they're very expensive. Okay, this is a very significant purchase. And it's not something that consumers can, they buy the car and go, oh, darn, now it tracks me, I need to buy a different car. You can't do that, right? So there should be special consideration just for that reason. But also they're highly necessary. I mean, in Australia, just like here in the United States, you can cover extremely very large distances. Being part of society and having a productive life requires very often having your own vehicle. And so to say this is optional, I could choose to not be on social media. Arguably, nowadays it's becoming harder and harder, right? But in theory, I could at least try to do that. But I cannot get to work, or I cannot take my kids to school, or take my mom to the hospital if I don't have a car. It's a very different level of fundamental need. And the third thing is that, again, there's safety and security implications with cars that are really not the same with your home Alexa. So I think it's important that people look at them. But unfortunately, the industry does exactly the opposite. Very often, industry players look at laws and say, well, the law doesn't say the word car, so it doesn't apply to us. And I often tell them, well, the law on privacy doesn't really say computer either, or tablet. It doesn't mean it does not apply to those things either. But there's a little bit of logjam in the industry because, again, they have this big gold prize at the end of the rainbow that they're trying to reach, of these hundreds of billions of dollars. And so privacy is just not very convenient. Personally, I think they have the wrong perspective, because if consumers want privacy, why don't we give it to them? I think that companies that focus on privacy would actually be very successful in selling more.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to make the point that people are paying for the privilege of letting other people spy on them as well, of course. As you say, 40% of the cost of the car is the electronics inside it. It sort of seems crazy in one sense. I was going to ask you this, if it is the case that, and if cars are accessible by internet, by wireless means, is there any evidence that cars could be remotely accessed and controlled? I mean, that must be a question that comes up every now and then.
Yes. So there's first of all, there's unfortunately a very long history of actual real world cases. It used to be only researchers do these kind of things, but nowadays, unfortunately, we start to see a number of criminal hackers that actually go and tap into systems and do bad things with the data that is collected by vehicles. So yeah, this is a real thing that is truly happening nowadays. It's very concerning. The industry is paying attention to security, but you may have seen it, for instance, here in the United States. There's a lot of pressure on trying to understand how Chinese manufacturers are using data collected from cars. And I know that in Australia, in the United States, we haven't had imports from China yet, but for you, that's a reality today. And people need to realize that that's a very real possibility. And in fact, in China, for instance, government officials are not allowed to drive a Tesla. And Teslas are not allowed on military compounds. They're not allowed on government compounds, and so on and so forth. And if they're concerned, why shouldn't we be concerned about their
So
cars?
let's just be clear about that. We're talking about somebody accessing your car, whoever it may be, and controlling the motion of the car. That you're saying that's a very real concern.
Yeah, so we're talking, first of all, surveilling people. That is definitely a very clear possibility, and in fact, it's probably happening today with millions of cars on the road. When it comes to remote controls, again, there's been a number of hackers who have achieved this in the past. Companies are paying attention to this, as you can imagine, because the outcomes of something like that, especially on a large scale, because if you learn how to hack, this make and model, it's not one car that you can affect. You can affect, millions of cars potentially. And so the consequence has been so severe. Companies, of course, are paying a lot of attention to securing those vehicles. I think that people really need to realize that every time you connect something, you have just raised the stakes a lot on what you need to think about in terms of security and privacy.
And I guess, there's so much you could cover off on the detail of this, but I think people, are going to be quite intrigued to hear all of this. What are the basic steps people can take? Obviously a lot of this stuff is tucked away, and probably integral to the operation of the vehicle. You presumably can't just take out a SIM card and expect the car to function properly. What do people do?
Yes. Well, so believe it or not, there's a few things that you can do. So first of all, I believe, that informed consumers are always better off. And I know that nobody really likes to read those privacy policies, right? But we have started to analyze the Australian privacy policies of a number of manufacturers. We haven't published them yet. I think it's going to happen later this year, but at least as a reference point, you can either go to the Mozilla report. Mozilla is a nonprofit, and read the report for your automaker. Or we have created, a few months before they launched the report, a website called vehicleprivacyreport.com, and you punch in the VIN of your car and change the geography, because again, we don't cover Australia and New Zealand today yet, give it a few months. But if you look at what disclosures are made in Canada, in the United States, and the UK, it's the same car. They work pretty much the same. And you will start to have an understanding of what type of data the car collects, where does it goes, is it shared, is it sold, what type of features the car comes with, right? So for me, as a consumer, we want to know, does my car has its own SIM card or it doesn't? Does it has a GPS or it doesn't? Because sometimes cars don't have a GPS, but they don't have a navigation. So people think that they don't have a GPS, but they actually do, right? So once start to know what your car does, if you're shopping for a car, I would recommend do the same. And then at the very least, when you're ending a rental or you're selling your car, make sure you delete your data. Don't leave a mini clone of your cell phone behind. Do yourself this favor, right? And if you don't know how to do it, ask the salesperson at the dealership or ask the rental car company to do it for you. And make sure they either do it in front of you or that they give you a written confirmation, because unfortunately, we have a lot of evidence that people are promised that certain things will happen, but actually they don't.
And I guess, some of it's just unavoidable, but, in terms of day-to-day things as well, presumably the less apps you have, the less location services on those apps, but it feels very much like bailing water out of the Titanic when it comes to privacy issues. Are those things helpful as well?
Laws will be very helpful in fixing those kind of things. And clearly, as you can imagine, it depends on a geography by geography basis, what you can do. There are things that are in your control. For example, you should decide whether to install the app of the manufacturer or not. I go a little bit against the current, and I tell everybody you should absolutely download the app and you should absolutely plant the flag and say that this is your car, because that's how you'll typically know whether somebody else is also attached to the car. And believe me, you don't want somebody else attached to your car. You don't want somebody else that, because this, in the hands of the wrong person, has become a spare key. But it's worse than a spare key. It's a stocking machine plus a spare key, right? And so you definitely want to download the app. You definitely want to create an account. You definitely want to make sure that you're the, assigned by the manufacturer as the rightful owner. And then up to you to decide you want to ditch it because you don't want to be tracked also by the app, or you want to keep it because you like the convenience features. But make sure at the very least that nobody else has access to your car, because that will be, for me, a very big concern.
It's actually quite, it's sort of staggering information. The sort of last topic I want to just cover off on you is from a legislative point of view. Are there things happening in the United States that are sort of pushing lawmakers towards? You mentioned some Senate inquiries before about law enforcement and access to data, but is the issue getting any traction in the United States?
Yes, not so much at the federal level. I think you may be aware we're trying to pass a federal law, and it's just not getting done. But states have acted. Right now, I think there are 16 or 17 states that have passed their own privacy law in the United States. So you have all this big patchwork. Canada is also trying to update their privacy law. I'm aware that Australia is trying to pass, an updated privacy law. So good luck. I hope that brings some additional protection to consumers. But also enforcers have been extremely active. California created its own enforcement agency. And the very first action that they announced was that they will be looking into cars. Not social media, not search engines, but cars, which I think should tell you really where the ugliness really is, and that's cars nowadays. But now there's an active investigation in Texas that has become public, but many other states' attorney generals are investigating the matters. And you may have seen scandals on the news of people paying more for insurance because their car, told a data broker, sold data to a data broker, the data broker sold their insurance, and their rate doubled, or they couldn't insure their car anymore because their insurance company dropped them. And the more stories like this happen, and the more I think it's going to be hard for companies to keep the current stance that this data is valuable and we should monetize it at all costs. And instead, they should really be thinking, is this what consumers want when they buy a car? And the answer is increasingly no.
And so from a place like Australia's point of view, what if you are talking to people that are, in departments, government departments and legislators, what should we be doing here, do you think, in your mind, to sort of protect consumers and protect their privacy?
Well, I don't know how to give you advice, Alex, here, but I can tell you that in Europe, for example, Europe has extremely strong laws, but enforcement has not been quite there. The US hasn't had really very strong laws, with a few exceptions of a few states, but enforcement has been very active. And I can tell you from our perspective, companies in the United States have been a lot more reactive to try to do the right thing, because the pressure of consumers being vocal, being outed in the news, and the legal, we're just a very litigious country here in the United States, that has created the situation in which companies have been moved to act. And in fact, I can tell you that many auto finance companies and dealerships and insurance companies, et cetera, here have started to set up an entire series, a book of this is what we need to do to protect cars when they finance them, when they, when a vehicle is considered a total loss, when a trade-in is accepted, when we sell a new or a used car, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a good thing. It's obviously not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because consumers read the news and consumers are upset. I mean, I can tell you, I saw a recent statistic here in the United States that said 9 out of 10 consumers don't trust the manufacturer with their data. That doesn't paint a good picture of the industry. and 40% of consumers almost say that data privacy is highly important in their vehicle shopping experience. Last year, the number was 0. So again, I know that today, probably in Australia, this is probably many in your audience is the very first time that they thought about vehicle privacy, but I promise you that this topic is gonna pick up steam because everybody has a car. And we all think, I remember giving a name to my first car. Like we think of them almost as a member of the family. And to have a member of the family that rats you out and raises your insurance, come on. It's just not good.
Look, it's a fascinating topic. There's so much more to cover. I guess people can learn more at www.privacyforcars.com, I think is your website. And they follow you on social media as well. How else do they get? Do they follow you on Twitter, or how else do they see what your work is doing?
Our website has a lot of information. We provide a lot of free services to consumers. It's just part of our ethos. We think it's important that we have a social mission beyond being a business. So please come check us out. It's Privacy for Cars. It's privacy number 4 cars. And the other website I recommend is Vehicle Privacy Report because it gives a good snapshot of what you're driving. I think people would find it fascinating, maybe horrifying, but I think it's important.
Fascinating and horrifying, absolutely right. Andrea Amico, thank you so much. Thank you for the work you're doing, and thanks for coming on and sharing some of that information. I think Aussies are going to be pretty interested in that. So thanks for coming on Based, and we look forward to following your work in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex.